I am Lee Brumrickham Wood. I am the lead game designer. I've been here right from the beginning, essentially designing and defining the entire game from the start. So I'm afraid an awful lot of what is there is what I'm responsible for. I have a number of people who are working with me in terms of trying to refine that design, but a lot of my focus at the moment is very much on ensuring the quality of the game and also ensuring the various models and combat models in the game are all balanced.
One of the big things about the way we've made this game is our approach to the characters and the characterization. Obviously in this genre, quite a lot of the way it's approached is that you have disposable heroes. But as we're talking about a point in time where we really wanted to tell a key story, we wanted to make sure those characters are front and centre. They don't die. They have stories to tell, and those stories persist all the way through the game to the very end.
When it comes to the characters, we're definitely taking inspiration from history, and we're drawing from actual anecdotes of the era. In some cases to make our characters interesting or to give them kind of quite rich backgrounds. For example, one of Tom King's stories relates to a real-world incident. We made Tom King in his civilian life a bit-part actor who, when he gets his call-up papers, he's actually wearing Gestapo uniform at the time because he's actually standing on a movie set at Denham Studios, and this is actually based on the true story of an actual officer who got his call-up papers whilst dressed as a Gestapo member. But there are other kind of incidents that we're sort of drawing into a number of the pieces of the narrative. They're drawn from some of the resistance characters, that are drawn from various other anecdotes of the war. Probably one of the biggest decisions we made right from the start was that we were not going to have characters that the players could create and assemble, because those characters would be very anonymous. We really wanted to have characters that would convey a story, and that immediately pushed us in the direction of wanting to have a lot of different kinds of character, both American and British and French, and each of them having their own individual stories, because we really wanted that kind of like human factor, that personal story to come through. So we began with the idea of we were going to have a very diverse cast, and we weren't checking any boxes on this, but we knew that part of the story of the resistance included women. They are in a lot of the literature undersung, and we really wanted to tell some of their stories. And there were other members of sort of French society that we wanted to show. We wanted to have a character who was Jewish, for example. We wanted to have a character who was a colonial soldier and have their experience reflected in the game. So we wanted to come at the story from many, many different angles with many, many different characters. So once we'd sort of taken that approach, it was then very much about trying to think, who were these people? And we knew that we wanted some of those to be American. We knew that some of them were going to be British. Now, we sort of made a big choice here in that historically the Jedburgh teams were basically a mixture of British, French and American, but we wanted to introduce some other Commonwealth soldiers as well. So we introduced an Australian, we introduced a Canadian. It was stretching history very slightly, but we felt it was appropriate because we could get those stories in as well. And then we had the French themselves coming from very, very different backgrounds. We wanted some to be quite conservative, we wanted some to be quite radical, to fit some of the background framing of the game. And even somebody who was perhaps a little bit dodgy, a kind of black marketeer, because the black market was very large in France at that time. And so from these, slowly the characters began to coalesce, and we started to think in terms of, okay, these are a number of different tracks, these are a number of different stories. So we have, for example, one of the lead characters who is Willard Cassidy. He's American. He comes in as an outsider, and he comes in with a very, very strong voice. But then we wanted to contrast him with, for example, a radical French student who might not actually appreciate the Americans being on French soil. And it was kind of interesting to think, how do these two characters bounce off each other? And from that we were starting to think of, oh right, we can have them talking amongst themselves, and we can have them having conversations where, for example, the student says, well, we're happy to have you here to help kick out the Germans, but perhaps once the war's over, we want you to leave. And the American says to him, well, what happens if we don't leave? And then the student says, well, we'll fight you then. These were kinds of narratives that we felt were authentic to the period and started to actually place all these characters in a kind of rich and complex world. So we have conversations of, for example, between some of the women who may have been involved in counterfeiting and producing counterfeit documentation, or were involved in helping smuggle children across the border into Switzerland, and they had stories amongst themselves. And we had, other characters. We've got an Australian who came to Europe via the Middle East, and he has stories of fighting. His first experience of fighting in World War II was actually fighting Vichy French in the Lebanon. And then he has to come to France and suddenly finds himself fighting alongside French against Germans. And that was a kind of a whiplash for him. And all these rich stories started flowing out, and we thought, from this we were beginning to develop some really interesting characters. In terms of kind of like the visual design, we took a little bit of license. We obviously are not allowed to use likenesses of real people, but there was definitely a sense of, well, this character, this guy Tom King, we can make him look a little bit like Richard Todd. Richard Todd being kind of a movie actor of the era, and actually in real life a man who dropped at Pegasus Bridge on D-Day and was played his own commanding officer in the movie The Longest Day. Or we could, if we wanted a French character, we could say he's not actually got to look like Jean-Paul Belmondo, but we can make him look a little bit in that direction. And so we were using sort of real world character models, and we were using those to inspire and influence our character designs. One of the things I wanted to avoid when we were writing particularly the dialogue was that we wanted to avoid too many of the cliches of the horrors of war. An awful lot of the world they come in from is quite mundane. What they're interested in is actually the kind of the pop culture and the world in which they live. They talk about jazz music, they talk about swing music, they talk about cigarettes, they talk about the price of butter and how in France black market butter is outpricing the price of meat. They're talking about their relatives, they're talking about all those things that really concern them, rather than necessarily, oh, how miserable war is. But what's very clear is that everything that they're talking about is overshadowed by the fact that they're at war. So they're talking about cigarettes, but they're talking about how awful the German cigarettes that they steal are. Or everything is overshadowed by the fact that food is very hard to come by, and so they're very reliant on black market supply. And so all of these things try and show some of the mundanity of the war, and how the fact that they are living in Nazi-occupied territory slowly is kind of impinging upon them and starting to crush them and starting to be quite oppressive in their lives. And that is, I think, something we wanted to get out, we wanted to communicate without going through the usual war movie cliches. In terms of the missions themselves, again, we sort of draw from history. There's a lot of accounts of various firefights that the special forces were involved in, the resistance were involved in. But we're also drawing from sort of wider sources. We wanted to go as much as possible for a wide variety of different kind of mission types. And so in some cases we were drawing in missions that may be set in quite exotic settings, such as taking on the flying bombs and taking on the V2 rockets or submarine pens. And so we drew from quite a wide variety of both real world sources and fictional sources to kind of get some of the exciting missions that we really wanted to generate. A problem with realism is that what people perceive as realism is actually not at all. They're taking their cues very often from the movies, or they're taking from fiction. And so sometimes when confronted with actual realism, if we start to plug real world numbers into a lot of our data, then they don't always accept it. I mean, a good example of this, for example, was grenades in the game that were very, very powerful with wide radiuses. And we had some feedback from people saying, well, that seems very unrealistic. They're like nukes, these grenades. And I had to say to them, well, actually, this is half the real world value of a real fragmentation grenade. And so the game reality is very, very different from real reality. And so we kind of have to edge towards what people's expectations are in terms of game and gameplay requirements for our game, as opposed to real world requirements. As one historian sort of said to me, if we were to make a real war game, then it's going to be 12 hours of play just standing at a guard post, not doing anything. And he's sort of making the point that a lot of real world and a lot of really authentic events and history do not really fit within the gameplay context.
One thing I'm very proud of is the way that we've depicted northern France in World War II in our level art. I think that the art team have done a fantastic job of taking the design blockouts, where the designers create the levels and the missions, and actually turning into something stunning looking, but also organic, and actually depicting forests and streams and rivers alongside the buildings and the villages that really look like World War II in northern France. Many tactical games that use this point of view can actually look quite blocky, but actually I'm very pleased with the way that we've actually created a very organic looking world. Forests, trees, bushes, streams, birds, rabbits, all these kinds of things that really depict and show off the atmosphere that we wanted to get across.